All right, well, it is 10 o'clock, so I do want to be mindful of time and get us all started this morning. So, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us with Coffee with the Coalition. My name is Inesu. I'm the Training and Events Manager with IKESA. And today we will have a national policy updates, and that'll be provided by Terry Poor. Before we get into that today, though, I want to kind of go over a few technical tips on our call today. So if you need to access the captions at the very bottom window, you can go ahead and click those three buttons that say more, and then click captions, and it should produce the captions for you. If you need to change your display name, you want to go ahead and click on the participants button at the very bottom window again, and then that'll allow you to change your name. This is also where you'll mute yourself. I ask that you remain remuted. Or ask that you remain muted unless you have a question. And if so, you can feel free to use the raise hand feature and then we can call on you. You can also utilize the chat box if you don't want to come off mic or come on camera. If at any point during our meeting or session today you need technical assistance, please reach out directly to info@IKESA in the chat, and I'll be able to assist you. And just as a friendly reminder, our session today will be recorded. So, like I said, today we have Terry Poor here with us. She is the policy director for the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence, where she specializes in finding those policy solutions to the problem of sexual violence. She has decades of experience working in anti-sexual violence, and more than 15 years with the NAESV. And so today she'll be providing us with some good information. So I'm going to turn over the airwaves on over to her. Thank you so much for being here today, Terry.
Absolutely. Thank you so much to the Indiana Coalition to End Sexual Assault for inviting me. It's such a pleasure to be with you all this morning. I'm Terry Poor, the Policy Director of the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence. And as I shared with the Indiana Coalition team, it's always such a pleasure and so rewarding for me to do these sorts of events with local programs, especially if I hope to get to hear from you all as well. I deeply honor the work that you're doing at the local level. There's nothing more important in the world. Just a little bit of background on me. I've spent a lot of my career living and working in North Florida. Tallahassee, Florida is where I'm calling in from today. And I started in a local program, a local dual program that serves an 8 county rural and suburban area here in North Florida, and worked at the Florida Council Against Sexual Violence for a number of years. So I just want to say I know where you come from and doing this local work, and it is really, really difficult and challenging in the best of times, and particularly challenging in many ways in terms of federal funding and those sorts of things right now. So we'll talk a little bit about that today, but just want to say how grateful and appreciative I am for what you do every day for survivors and to keep your communities safe. So really great to be with you all. And you are very ably represented by the Indiana Coalition team at the national level. Your folks are really make sure to come to everything they can and engage in conversations and represent you all really well. So you're lucky to have these folks as well. And I hope today can be pretty informal. I gathered up some information to share just about what we're doing now at the national level, where we're focused, but I want this to be relevant to you all. And I hope to take away some information about what are some glimmers of hope for you all, but also what is challenging that just really deeply helps inform our national policy work. Like, it comes from the field, it comes from the grassroots, and that's what really makes us strong as advocates on the national level, is to know what's really going on for you all and what you need and how we can better support you. So for those of you who don't know much about NAESV, I'm going to share a little bit about that. I'm going to talk about sort of the current policy climate. I'll talk a little bit about our annual funding survey, what we're asking for in FY26 in terms of federal funding, talk a little bit about why we think you all engaging in policy advocacy at the local level is so incredibly important. and touch a little bit on the sort of a framework that we're using right now for our messaging, which is about the economic impact of services and prevention, and then hopefully leave plenty of time for questions and discussion. Please feel free to jump in at any point in the chat, or I know your slides said raise your hand or unmute yourself. Like, I'm glad to have this be a back and forth, not a formal thing at all. But just to share a little bit about the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence, our organization really started from coalition folks in the 90s who wanted to make sure there was a strong policy presence in the nation's capital around the issues that local programs were facing. And so we really work to support survivors and those who've experienced sexual assault. And we also focus a lot on prevention. And so through the state sexual assault coalitions, we hope to represent the over 1,000 local programs around the country, both mainstream and culturally specific, who are providing those community responses to sexual assault and prevention. And we work with a broad network of other national organizations, both in the sexual assault space, but also in the domestic violence space, the crime victim space more broadly, around these issues. So we really try to work in coalition with folks. So the thing we work most on is advocacy, appropriations advocacy around these federal funding sources, but we work on policy in a broad way as well. And then we try to provide support to the coalitions around state policy too. So that's great. You can keep moving with the slides. Thank you so much. I appreciate Inesu doing the slides for me today, because I want to drop some stuff in the chat, and between the slides and the chat, is a struggle for me. So I want to be able to keep an eye on the chat. So I appreciate her help with that. So there's a lot going on with the current policy climate every day, and every day things change and there's new stuff to deal with. And so I hope this will not be an exhaustive conversation about what's going on in the current policy climate, but I thought I would touch on a few things just to level set things you probably know, but that we're sort of dealing with, and that every new presidential administration brings changes and shifts, but this administration has, been particularly intense with regard to what's going on with federal funding. And one thing we've seen was a lot of early executive orders related to things like gender ideology and diversity, equity, inclusion, and DEI work that I think made a number of us go like, how does this affect our work? And, and we don't, there are some ways we still don't know. And I think what we've seen in the climate that you all are probably seeing too is that there's a lot of fear and concern about how these executive orders might impact our funding sources and our work. What we've seen concretely, and I'll talk about some of this with the HHS reorganization too, but what we've seen concretely at DOJ with the Violence Against Women Act is that the solicitations were taken down off the website. We're waiting to see some of those solicitations come back up, the open ones, and we expect and we're told that that could be any day, and that there'll be changes as a result of these executive orders, but we don't know exactly what those are. We've seen in the HUD space folks that are doing work with their continuum of care in the housing space, and sometimes that can mean certifications that folks don't break the law around anti-discrimination provisions, which of course none of us do. And so it's not exactly clear how that's going to play out. I'm going to drop some resources in the chat from the National Council of Nonprofits. I think they've had some really, really useful resources in case any of this is interesting to you all. They did a webinar where they've been so generous, even though NAASV at this point is not officially a member, but I think we should be, because they are providing some excellent resources on the impacts of recent executive orders on nonprofits. They also have a web form if folks want or move to talk about the impacts on their particular program, resources, and all those things. So I've shared some of that in the chat. I've found their resources really helpful. I think that There's so much uncertainty, and I know early on folks were like, do we have to take certain terms off our websites? And the folks at the national level were like, oh, maybe we need to shift some things around. So there was some action on that. I think for a minute, we're in the process of creating a new website. So we did take our website down for a minute, but then we put it all back up just as it was. I think we feel like we have a footprint of our work out there, and the values we hold are very deep values that remain over time. Yet folks are concerned, like, what does this mean and all that sort of thing. And so one thing important that we've been coming back to is that the whole framework of diversity, equity, inclusion is really mostly relevant in an employment context. And by the way, values that we still stand by. But also the work that a lot of us are doing with regard to services and prevention isn't specifically DEI work. It's really more about providing services to everyone. And that's been a framework we've been talking about. And so we think in many ways that for service providers that the executive order relating to anti-DEI does not specifically pertain to services prevention. Of course, because we work on issues for a while there, we were calling our work gender-based violence work. Certainly, we think about issues of gender related to our work, but at the same time, I don't think any of us knows exactly what gender ideology specifically means. We do think it's important that all survivors have access to services and that all genders receive services. And so just sharing a little bit about our orientation to this, there's no one right answer, but it is something we're all dealing with, like this environment with executive orders. And we have seen some real impacts in terms of, we've seen lists of words that people shouldn't use and all those sorts of things. We're still at a point with it where it's still vague in some ways, and we're all wrestling with that. And we're sort of wrestling with the like, we want to be smart, and we want to take our time in thinking through these things in ways that are protective of our ability to continue to get funding to provide services, and we want to uphold our values. And so there hasn't been like a real like clarity of exactly how to do that, right? Everyone's got to navigate that in their own way. And also we haven't seen a lot of direct impacts on our funding sources yet. Where we have seen a real big and concerning impact is with the current HHS reorganization, specifically at the CDC, where the Rape Prevention and Education and Delta programs sit at the Injury Center and the Division of Violence Prevention, which, the Rape Prevention and Education program was authorized. It was the first sexual assault program in the original Violence Against Women Act. So it was authorized and has been reauthorized. So that's what we're finding is a real strength. When a program is authorized, that means there is statutory context and support for that program. And so that's a really good thing about the rape prevention education program. But unlike other VAWA programs, it sits at the CDC. And what you all probably saw in the last couple of weeks is that there's a major reorganization going on at HHS, and that is include what they call reductions in force or RIFs, and that has had an immense impact on the CDC, on the Division of Violence Prevention and the Injury Center. In fact, pretty much the entire staff of the program research and evaluation units of the Division of Violence Prevention, all those staff were let go. And so while technically that RPE funding is still flowing, we know that that's having impacts on all of us. And I hope to have time to hear how that's impacting you all specifically in Indiana too. Absolutely. Just know that your stories help support me in being a strong advocate at the national level. And so always really want to hear what's actually going on the ground. What we're hearing around the country is that the formula grant funds come down through the state health departments for the rape prevention and education program, RPE, and that states have felt nervous with this. I mean, one of the main impacts of all this chaos and insecurity is that people feel nervous about doing things they may have historically done. So for example, if a funding source is a week late, or you've been promised the funding, but it hasn't arrived in your account yet. I think states and coalitions and local programs have felt fairly comfortable and used to like moving ahead with the work. But what we notice in this environment, and it's one of the ways that both the concrete and the lack of concrete stuff going on has a very real impact because people are insecure, right? And so they're not sure what to do. And so what we've heard from a number of states and local programs are things like, states haven't let out their funding, their RPE funding yet because they feel uncertain about it, that it's taking longer to get drawdowns, and that that's affecting local programs. And we've heard, that some local programs have even started to say, like, you know what, I don't really want to receive this funding source anymore because it's, we're not sure about it. We are hoping in every case possible local programs still feel confident to move forward, but we understand not people don't always have reserves, that staffing is a very tricky issue. And so these are some of the things that we're hearing that are, deeply concerning. At the same time, we're all trying to push forward as much as we can with what we know, and hoping, the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence provides training and TA with a couple of federal funding sources too. We get money from the Office of Family Violence Prevention and Services to provide sexual assault TA, and we have a housing grant from the Office on Violence Against Women. So we're in the same boat with you all, just with the insecurity, but trying to keep moving ahead, trying to, put one foot in front of the other, and also not overreact, which is all a really tricky thing to do. So that's just a little bit about the executive orders and the HHS reorg, which are the really concrete things we're looking at. We've also heard that there's a desire there's a desire from the administration to do some consolidation at the Department of Justice. We're not exactly sure what that means for the Office on Violence Against Women yet, but we're engaged in a lot of administrative advocacy and legislative advocacy. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about why we think this is such an important moment to build and strengthen relationships with our members of Congress and our policymakers in general, because we're really relying on those relationships to sort of help us through this time. So one of the things that I mentioned, just to touch on it one more time, that is so strong for us at, like, for example, with the Office on Violence Against Women, with the Violence Against Women Act recently within the last few years being reauthorized, that gives us some strong statutory protections around some things we care about. For example, and you may already know this, VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, has the only federal statutory protection specifically around gender orientation and sexual orientation and gender identity. And so those protections are actually in law. And that we do notice that the administration is is mindful of where there's statutory authority and statutory support for the work that we do. And so that's a real strength, something that we think is really important. There's also the Violence Against Women Act authorizes a culturally specific grant program. So again, that statutory authority to do specific work in communities of color, we feel like that's a real strength. And so we're kind of watching what's next. I think we're expecting some more news out of OVW any day now, but just keeping an eye on those things. And we'll know a lot more when we see those solicitations come back out and see how they're changed. And then in terms of the FY26 outlook, so it's weird. I mean, I don't feel like we've had a normal year in any time that I can remember. As you know, the FY25, so the fiscal year for the federal fiscal year begins on October 1st and ends September 30th. So we're currently living the second half of the FY25 federal fiscal year. And you know that just in the last month, that appropriations process was completed with the continuing resolution, a CR, to fund the government at the same levels that it had been funded in FY24. Typically, and like nothing feels typical right now, but typically some of the work that's done around appropriations is handled in what's called report language. And we're all watching really carefully to see how the Trump administration handles report language. It doesn't have the force of law, so that's just another thing we're watching. But as we turn our attention to FY26, which will start this October 1st, right? So we're in FY25, but we're always working on appropriations for the year ahead. In normal times, we would see a presidential budget come out at the end of the winter season. It's typically delayed with the new administration. We're hearing that we'll see budget from the Trump administration probably in May. I've heard everything from May 12th to May 26th, but somewhere in May. That will give us a lot of indication of um, the Trump administration's priorities around budget, either things to fund or things not to fund. So we have our eye on that for sure. And then every year the Congress is really, you've heard this over and over again. Congress has the power of the purse. So it's really Congress that shapes appropriations. And so that process for FY26 has started. We work really closely with the subcommittees and we'll talk a little bit more about this later in the presentation, but we work really closely with the committees that work on the federal priorities that we care about. We work through the coalitions and you all to really contact members of Congress to talk about our priorities. And then they, as a result, put in member requests. And those historically, our ability to have a lot of people say the sexual assault services program is important to us. The rape prevention education program is important to us. VOCA is important to us. The sheer numbers that we're usually able to get of people like weighing in with their members of Congress about that has enabled us over the years to make a strong bipartisan case for funding those programs. And we're hoping to do that again in FY26, but again, in a time that's more complex and challenging. So that's a little bit about the current policy climate. We can move on now to talk a little bit more about some of our specific funding requests. And I wanted to talk to you too about our annual funding survey. So every year we do a funding survey that informs our work at the national level. It gives us an opportunity to really talk about what you all, the local programs, are experiencing. I'm going to drop our infographic in the chat. And we do this every year to talk about Congress about what programs are experiencing with regard to funding, staffing, and services. And so you can move on to the next slide. So we had really good participation this year. We'll have a state report for Indiana soon, but couldn't get it together in time for this presentation. But 9 Indiana programs participated in the survey. And we ultimately had 507 programs participate this year, which is really pretty good for us. And so we felt like it was a pretty robust survey this year. So you can keep going on the slides. I'm kind of just giving some overviews here. So some of the things that we found were that, backup one. Yeah, thank you. Perfect. 40% of rape crisis centers that we surveyed saw a decrease in funding for direct services to survivors of sexual assault. We think that's largely probably because of VOCA cuts, but I'd love to hear from y'all if you are experiencing something similar or different and want to know what you're seeing. And 35% of RCC's rape crisis centers saw a decrease in funding for prevention of sexual violence. Okay, and then the next slide. Nearly half of rape crisis centers experienced a reduction in staffing for sexual assault services and or prevention this year. And that a very high number, 84%, indicated that they would need additional staff to meet the current demand. Almost 2/3 of rape crisis centers report having 0 full-time therapists or mental health counselors on staff. And that's something we talk a lot about, the importance of if we're really going to provide accessible healing services for survivors of sexual assault in ways that allow them to really get their lives back, that we really need to have more therapists available to survivors. So despite decreased capacity, 60% of programs reported an increase in demand for prevention. Almost 60% reported an increase in demand for services. Almost half, 44% of programs reported an increase in demand for services for adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse. And that's something we've really been highlighting at the national level, especially in the last several years at HHS, just the importance of having a public health response both to survivors who have recently experienced sexual assault, but also for adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse, since we know with like the ACEs study and all that sort of thing, how much childhood trauma impacts folks long term. So really trying to build the case for making sure survivors of distant sexual abuse and sexual assault have access to the services they need. And then of the 85 rape crisis centers with the therapist on staff, 1/3 of those had a wait list for trauma-informed therapy, and almost more than 2/3 had wait lists for counseling. So that's just a little window into our survey, just to give you an impression of what we're seeing around the country. I'd love to hear later or even now about how that matches up with your experiences. Okay, so now I'm going to jump into our specific FY26 appropriations congressional requests. And so we are focused on the Victims of Crime Act, the Crime Victims Fund Stabilization Act, the Sexual Assault Services Program, the Rape Prevention and Education Program. And we're trying to really increase and strengthen our foothold at the HHS Office of Family Violence Prevention and Services with regard to rape crisis services, partnerships, and resources. So I know VOCA is near and dear to every advocate's heart, and it's been such an important, in fact, my very first position in this work back in the mid 90s at the local program I worked with in North Florida, my position was funded by VOCA. It was important then, it's important now, and we know that the ups and downs of VOCA have been really difficult for the field. And yeah, you can go on to that VOCA slide now too. I really appreciate, Vanessa, you're doing an awesome job. I know it's hard to change somebody else's slides. And so you all have probably been watching as we have the fluctuations in the Crime Victims Fund, and that the deposits had been really going down in the fund. And that's something we've all been watching. As you all know, VOCA's fund is a non-taxpayer source of funding that's funded on criminal convictions at the federal level at DOJ. So when the U.S. attorneys go out and prosecute a case, historically it's been large white collar kind of crime sort of cases. That money comes into the Crime Victims Fund, and it funds the victim services infrastructure of the country. So sexual assault services, domestic violence services, human trafficking services, but also law enforcement, victim advocates, prosecutor victim advocates, mothers against drug driving. It's really our broadest source of federal crime victim services supports. And so the deposits into that fund had been going down over administrations in a really concerning way. Many of you may have worked on the VOCA Fix Act, which definitely helped, but I mean, it made it so that we could keep going, but it didn't help enough. We did see some really big settlements just in the last year that really improved the health of the fund out of, like, we were all just felt like we were really in crisis with the Crime Victims Fund. But after that, FY24, what we call it a cut, even though it's really the amount of money that's released, but logically it's seen and experienced as a cut in FY24 from 1.9 to 1.3 billion. I think that's where we really saw that 40% cut in VOCA that a lot of local programs really felt. One really great thing about the FY25 continuing resolution, through our collective advocacy, we were able to ask for what's called an anomaly. So when you do a continuing resolution, it's usually just everything is funded exactly the same. But an anomaly is when they say, like, okay, this one thing's going to change about from FY24. We were able to successfully advocate for an anomaly in the FY25 continuing resolution to bring VOCA back up to that 1.9 that it had been in FY23. And so and again, the way VOCA is administered, and I'm not sure exactly how this works in Indiana, every state is different, but states have 3 years to spend VOCA money. Some states hold it back, some states spend it right away. So where local programs feel the changes, it depends on the state. But I will just say this was really good news that 1.9 billion is being released for FY25. So hopefully that will start to be felt soon in the field. And our ask for FY26 is to again provide 1.9 billion to provide steady funding from the Crime Victims Fund. And again, it's just an incredibly important source of funding and always a priority, not just for us, but for a broad coalition of organizations that we work very closely with, the domestic violence groups, the CACs, all of those groups really work together on VOCA. Yeah, Beth.
Hey Terry, thanks so much for being here. It's just great to see you.
You
I am
too.
burdened with knowing more than I wish I did about this whole VOCA thing. But I have a question that I think might be useful for all of us.
Okay.
Because of the anomaly, the 1.9 is going to be released through the budget year that we're actually in right now.
Yeah.
Um, and that's because the fund is healthier than we thought it would be, right?
Yes.
So how else is the money used? And what I mean by that is if the fund is really healthy and other people in the Department of Justice look at that and say, oh, well, how about we use this to fund police officers or other kinds of things, right? Is it dedicated to our purposes of the VOCA, what we use for VOCA around the country, or could it be reallocated to different programs within the Department of Justice? I'm starting to get concerned the Department of Justice reorganization is going to put everything on the table that we didn't even think could be true. If you've got any thoughts about that, I'd appreciate
Yeah,
it.
I mean, I think there's reason to be concerned about absolutely everything these days. Like, I feel like I was one of those people who historically is like, it's going to be okay. But I mean, like, I can't, can't really in good conscience say that right now. So, what we've seen in the past, like, historically, there has been and there is some statutory authority here. VOCA hasn't been reauthorized in a long time, unlike VAWA, but there is like a lot of clear history about it being specifically for victims of crime. What we've seen in various administrations, both Democratic and Republican, sometimes is a desire for the administration to set out priorities by like saying, okay, we're going to take 100 million of VOCA off the top to fund this thing or that thing. It could be law enforcement. And so we don't really know. I haven't heard it, and if you have, please share. I haven't heard anything very specific yet, but you raise a good point that it's really important for us to not just talk about the importance of how much to release, but that money stays sacred for victim services. So I don't have a really concrete answer, but you make a good flag, Beth, just for us to keep our eye on that.
I appreciate that. And I know that even though the fund is healthy, we have to ask for the appropriation. And so
We
that's why the
do.
1.9 is really important and
It's healthy-ish, right? It's
healthy-ish, right?
healthier. It's healthier. It's
Right.
it's got a long way to go. There
Right.
isn't there isn't a lot of reserve in there at all. Like if we get 1.9 for FY26, it could come back down. And also we really don't know how much goes into the crime victims fund. There's so many variables, and one of those variables is what are the cases any particular administration chooses to go after. Like for example, we got that really big Binance settlement, which is a cryptocurrency. We've heard that this administration is less likely to go after some of those big bad actors like that. And so we don't know. It's an uncertain future for VOCA. Luckily, those big settlements got us out of the basement, at least for the moment. But so the appropriation and really just beating the drum about the importance of VOCA with your members of Congress is so important. We also have another strategy with VOCA, and you can go to the next slide, which is the Crime Victims Fund Stabilization Act. So we're going at this both through the appropriations process, but also through legislation. And what the Crime Victims Fund Stabilization Act does is looks at the False Claims Act and redirect some funds from the False Claims Act that are otherwise going to the Treasury to the Crime Victims Fund for the next several years to stabilize the fund. And the False Claims Act is a fund where if people defraud the government, so first money goes to protect any whistleblowers, to make the agencies whole, to make anybody whole. But then the money over the top of that goes back to the Treasury. And what we're saying is a good use of that while the Crime Victims Fund isn't particularly healthy is to redirect some of that funding for a few years to the Crime Victims Fund. And so we're working on this legislation. We have really good bipartisan support in the House. We're up to, I think, almost 150 co-sponsors. I checked yesterday, and there are 3 Indiana members of Congress who are co-sponsors of this bill. And I may get their names wrong. Yakim, Baird, and Mervan. Is that how you pronounce his name? And it's so funny. I've never seen an MRV combination of letters in
Yeah.
a name before, but I was like, so
Yeah.
those 3 Indiana members of Congress are co-sponsors of the Crime Victims Fund Stabilization Act. And Representatives Wagner from Missouri and Moran from Texas are the prime sponsors, and we're expecting companion legislation to be introduced in the Senate any moment now from Senators Murkowski and Durbin. And so this is a great issue to interface with your members of Congress about. So VOCA appropriations, the Crime Victims Fund Stabilization Act, and then we can move on and talk a little bit about the Sexual Assault Services Program. So at DOJ, our priorities are, Department of Justice, our priorities are VOCA and VAWA. Within the Violence Against Women Act, our priorities are culturally specific funding and the Sexual Assault Services Program, which also includes culturally specific funding. We've seen broad bipartisan support for this formula grant that goes out to all the states. And I know sometimes, depending on how states and do their federal funding, you may or may not, this may or may not be called SASP once it gets to you, right? I just know that different funding sources are combined, they flow through different state agencies. But just know your local programs are likely to be, and the coalition and culturally specific programs are likely to benefit from the SASP program. And it's really the signature sexual assault program, services program in the Violence Against Women Act. And it's authorized at $100 million in FY24 and FY25. It was funded at $78.5 million. And we've been requesting every year that it be appropriated at its full authorization of $100 million. So yeah, we love the SASP program. It was created in VAWA 2005 as really the first federal funding source to provide to support sexual assault services specifically. So unlike VOCA, that's all crime victim services, SASP is specifically sexual assault services. So those are our signature DOJ issues, VOCA and through VAWA, SASP, and culturally specific funding. Now moving over to the HHS side of the budget, we'll talk a little bit about the rape prevention and education program. So this is our signature prevention funding that's also a formula grant. So a formula grant means that it goes down to all the states through a state agency and is administered that way. And so the rape prevention and education program really focuses on primary prevention. It funds through the state health department people at the community level to do prevention. It also, with the most recent reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, also funds sexual assault coalitions. And so it's incredibly important. And as I mentioned in the beginning, we've seen some real concerning things happening with the rape prevention and education program in terms of the administration of the program, with the elimination of all the staff in the program office at CDC. It's left a lot of questions about how will this program be administered, who will be there to answer questions for people. Meantime, we're trying to, everybody just put one foot in front of the other to keep going, because we certainly don't want to give the impression that we don't need or this funding isn't valuable. So we know that this the rape prevention education program really has funded cutting edge prevention programs across the country, and we're super dedicated to seeing that work continue. That's been funded at $61.75 million in both the last two appropriation cycles. And while I don't know if you all remember in the House budget last year, they eliminated the injury center at the CDC entirely. And the injury center includes the rape prevention and education program, Delta, some firearms prevention work, suicide prevention, youth violence prevention. And, the CDC has been sort of in the sights of the Republican majority in the House for several years. And what I want to say about that is that's very concerning, right? But I will say this, in all our recent Hill meetings with committee staff, they've said, like, people aren't coming after RPE specifically. Now, I don't know what that's going to mean with all the insecurity and things moving around and all that sort of thing. But in terms of the funding for this program, we got to keep fighting for it. But I do think that there is a bipartisan support for continuing to get funding for this program. So that is good news. Okay, and then the other thing we're working a lot on in the HHS context is at the Office of Family Violence Prevention and Services. You all may know that, and some of you may have received American Rescue Plan funds, sexual assault funds administered through the FIPSA administrators at the state level, and you can change the slide, um, through the FIPS administrators to local programs that were really COVID related funds. Those funds run out at the end of this fiscal year. What we have been trying to do is really make the case for the importance of embracing a response to sexual assault at HHS, like a full, so the public health response, prevention response is at the CDC, but we really need a services response. And what the work at DOJ has been so important in terms of responding to the needs of sexual assault survivors in a criminal justice context. But what we're really trying to do is broaden the federal government's response to sexual assault to really see that many survivors have substance use issues as a result of their experiences of trauma, may have mental health issues, and that we really need to look at all of the different HHS response mechanisms and how those fit for sexual assault survivors. So we have been trying to really make the case on the Hill about the importance of funding rape crisis services, partnerships, and resources at OFIPS, the Office of Family Violence Prevention and Services, in an ongoing way, and not just let that end when the American Rescue Plan funds end at the end of this fiscal year. Unfortunately and very sadly, the director of the Office of Family Violence Prevention and Services, who has been so incredibly supportive of sexual assault work, was part of the reductions in force. So she lost her job a couple of weeks ago. And so that definitely is an issue for us at OFIPS in terms of the need for strong leadership during this time. So we've got our eye on that really carefully. That's some really bad news. Some good news is we are hoping to see introduced in the next few weeks some bipartisan legislation that looks to, this is an appropriations request at OFIPS, but looks to actually introduce some members of Congress are looking to introduce a bill to actually create a program to do this work that we want to do. So we're trying to do it from a variety of angles. So on the DOJ side, VOCA and SASP. On the HHS side, RPE, and then funding at the Office of Family Violence Prevention and Services. So those are our big appropriations asks for FY26. And so now we can talk a little bit about, I want to make the case for you about why in the middle of your very busy day, busy weeks, and in the middle of this chaotic time that I still want to ask you to prioritize educating your members of Congress. And just talk about how often I think about our work educating policymakers as the same as our prevention work in many ways. Because what we know about, there's so many overlaps, right? We know that in order to make change, you have to build trusted relationships over time. And so that what we think is really important is to think about ways to build those relationships. And look, we know you may not see eye to eye with every elected who represents you. I know I certainly don't, but that doesn't mean you can't work to build a relationship. And you're wanting to build a relationship where they see you as someone they can trust. And it really is just about telling the story of your program, right? You don't have to be an expert in legislative stuff. And what we found when we talk to local programs is you often, you might see your member of Congress at I don't know, what's the Indiana equivalent of a shrimp boil? You have to tell me. Barbecue, maybe, or like a little league game, or
we eat a lot of tenderloin in Indiana. So your tenderloin at the county fair is what I would say to that. That's probably going to be it.
Invite me for that, please. Yeah, so you might see them around town, or and know you might know some personal things about them, all right? I often, when we're talking to local programs about setting up meetings, they're like, oh yeah, his aide is on my daughter's soccer team, or the nurse at my doctor's office is married to blah, blah, you have the connections there. And so it's just so important to, and you can do this. I mean, certainly nonprofits can spend some time lobbying, but I'm not even talking about lobbying. I'm really just talking about educating members of Congress about your work, about what survivors need, and building a relationship over the long term. It's SAM right now. I don't know, Sexual Assault Awareness Month. I don't know I mean, y'all know what SAM is. But I don't know how many of you all are doing local events, but it's always great to invite your electeds. And obviously, because I do national advocacy, I focus on Congress and the House of Representatives and the Senate, Congress, but it's just as valuable to do this for your city commission, for your county commission, for your mayor, for your school board, as it is to do it for your state legislature. And I'm sure the Indiana Coalition is talking to you about that too. You know, just building that sense of mutual respect and trust over time. And so you can't, what we know is you can't come in and just say, like, I need you to do this thing, one and done. It doesn't work that way. Like, you really have to build these relationships over time. So you can go to the next slide. So as I said, your story is really the most important thing, you know, and Duke, I mean, I shared some data today. You can share some data. It's always great to have some stats, but just really just really talking through always a success story. Like what does your community have as a result of your work? And then how are your services limited by, and what could you do more with services or prevention if you had more funding? And we're really talking a lot about how rape crisis services and prevention have a great return on investment, right? You invest in your local community and you avoid other problems downstream, that when survivors have access to healing services and support, we know they're more likely to work with law enforcement through the criminal justice process. They're less likely to have PTSD and anxiety and suicide attempts, which are all costly things in the community, both to them personally, but also to the community at large. Okay, you can move on to the next slide. So we've been talking a lot about the economic impact of sexual assault. I'm going to share our messaging toolkit in the chat that goes into this a little bit more. But we've really been talking about how the fact that federal funding for victim services and prevention is a smart, high impact investment. As I said before, the data is clear. Services reduce long-term costs, improve public health, and make communities safer. And then you can go ahead and toggle through that slide. I think you all have probably seen this research that rape costs each survivor more than $120,000 over a lifetime, factoring in medical expenses, criminal justice activities, and lost work productivity. Sexual violence costs our economy $3.1 trillion over the lifespan of all 25 million victims in the United States population. And so we want to make the case that funding your programs is an important investment in a secure, both a safe community, and we do it because survivors need and deserve the services, but it's also a smart investment. Okay, next slide, please. Every dollar invested in services and prevention creates a ripple effect of savings and societal benefits. We know that services and prevention stabilize families, reduce long-term health expenses, minimize lost productivity in work and school, decrease homelessness, and ease the financial burden on the criminal justice system. It also fosters safer communities, empowers survivors to heal, and prevents future harm. So these are the kind of arguments we're making with members of Congress right now, and we think these could be strong arguments for this time. Okay. So we really want to take a message to policymakers of the importance of investing in solutions. And it's the right thing to do for sure, but it's also a strategic move toward a healthier, more prosperous future where fewer lives are impacted by violence. So my message to you all today is that we hope you will take these messages to your electeds in whatever way fits for you. And just know, when I say elected officials, I in the same breath also mean their staff. Like, we mostly work with staff. So yes, it's great if you can get a face-to-face meeting with your member of Congress, but developing a relationship with their district staff is also so powerful. And we know that has to happen over time. And that can involve, a sit down where you talk about your program and what you need. It can also involve having them come to an event. I know, not everyone's doing a town hall these days, but those members of Congress that are doing town halls, that's a great place to go and just have a question ready or just a sentence or two about your program. members of Congress are home right now. They're home this week and next week in district. So this is a great time to reach out to. I mean, depending on your community, sometimes you can even drop by the district office and just say like, hey, here's a brochure about my program. I'd love to set up time to talk. I just want you to feel really like, and I know you have a million things on your plate. I know you don't have time to do this. What we've been asking people to do is set aside 30 minutes an hour every week just to think about how to reach out to your electeds. And this is about education and building a relationship. Even if it's just an email or a phone call, just to weigh in, because we really feel like Congress is going to be so important to supporting our work in this next chapter. We know that we might face some really big hurdles, but we need our electeds to be really, really strong in the knowledge about the work we do and the importance of it. Okay, that is gets me to the end of the slides, and I would love to hear from you all. What questions do you have? What comments do you have for me? What do you think we should be focusing on or worried about? What are y'all worried about? What's giving you hope? All of those things are things I'm interested in hearing from you all about.